There's Matt Oaks, Uber driver, and I'm here with Jay, my neighbor. Jay Agardino.
I love gamble quail.
Gamble quail?
That's a thrasher right there.
There's the mate. It's been called.
Boy, these are ironwood trees right here.
It's called a natal plum.
Yes, take a sip.
Oh, it smells like Hawaii.
Take a sip. Yeah.
Oh, jeez. That is wonderful.
So, we can
School
take
of
more pictures
Architecture.
out in this area later. This is a public area. Why don't I get you inside?
All right.
Because you're about to miss the first building. Oh, that's so exciting.
So this was a school of architecture in 1938.
This is still a school of architecture. Students
Oh,
live and
so-
work on the property. That's why you have to have a guided tour.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
This organic architecture, the buildings look like they could have been here 100 years or 1,000 years, look like they're coming up out of the ground. Built on the cheap, I might add. All the stone was found on the property, all the sand for the mortar from the washes. That's why the buildings look like they do. It's organic architecture and the landscape, the environment meshing together to become one, okay? Now, as far as building the buildings is concerned, though, relatively simple to do. And why? It was going to be done by these kids. There was no paid staff here early on, no paid masons, carpenters, electricians, plumbers. And the reason for that, his philosophy of his apprenticeship program was learning by doing. So as you were building these buildings, you were learning architecture, okay? So, relatively simple to do. Now, I didn't say easy to do, I said simple to do, okay? Because it was going to be done by these kids. It's called Desert Masonry Rubble Stone Construction. And it's all form work, and really, folks, it has to be form work because the stone found on the property, the vast majority of that stone is a quartzite. And being quartzite means it's too difficult to be cut and shaped. So really, it has to be kind of placed in the walls as it's found. And naturally, the quartzite will have a flat side where it's flaked off. So what they did was they put up a wooden form, flat side of the stone out towards the form, smaller stones, rubble, and then finished off with a very, very dry mix of mortar. He wanted his mortar to be dry because he did not want it to flow over the face of the stones. Now, as they were building the walls, he was always insistent with those young apprentices that they be on the lookout for the color, the shape, the size of the stone. And the reason for that, he always described his walls here as a mosaic. That was how he described his walls, a mosaic. Okay? Then on top of these massive stone walls was a superstructure. Initially it was redwood. Anybody from the West Coast, you know redwood is a very, very durable product. It lasts a long, long time. Well, provided that you have low heat and high humidity. Well, we don't have either one of those, so it didn't last very long. So we tried some other soft woods, they didn't do much better. Ultimately went to metal. So the vast majority of the superstructures we're going to see here today are metal. Wood that you see up there is really going to be more ornamental than it really is structural anymore. It's to show you what it would have looked like when it was actually the superstructure. And folks, any place that you guys see glass here today, any place here in Tallahassee West that you see glass, early years, it was all open, okay? The birds would fly in, the birds would fly out, critters would roam in, roam out. This was his desert camp. So to him, these were basically permanent tents, if you will. So being a tent, there's canvas on the ceiling, canvas on the roof, there would be canvas side curtains that could be rolled down.
Not like the Victorian Capitol, which is in building, which is in Phoenix. So he designed this. Look, pro bono publico. But they never adopted it. It's beautiful.
Studio, and we're going to walk in front of the drafting studio on the first part of our tour, come behind it on the second part so you'll get a good overview of the building. It's about 96 feet long and anchored at the far end with a massive stone fireplace. Now, fireplace is important here. You guys only been here for a few days, you're not going to believe this, but nights and mornings in Arizona in the wintertime can be chilly, so it was their source of heat. But really more important, it was the hearth, center of a home, center of a building. It was always very important to his thoughts about architecture that he was practicing. And really, he would always tell you that a fireplace is not something that just should be added on to a building.
It should always be an integral part of the actual structure. In fact, he said it better. He said it should always be a fire burning deep in the actual masonry of the building, is how he said it. So each one of the spaces we're going to go into, massive stone fireplace, the hearth. Okay? In front of that fireplace would be drafting table, his apprentices, now used as study space and project space for the School of Architecture students. And then at this end would have been a piano, a grand piano, a Steinway grand piano. Had some lessons from his father, who was a composer and a musician early in his life, so he could read music, but he could also pick up melodies very well. He could improvise on the piano. He loved music. His two favorite composers, Bach, Beethoven. He said of them that they were great architects of music, like he was a great architect of buildings. That was the highest compliment he'd ever pay you, calling you a great architect of whatever discipline you happen to be pursuing. He loved music. In fact, he would really tell you there is no difference between architecture and music. He would tell you also the only differences really are the materials. He would also tell you that if you want to be great at either one of those disciplines, you must be a poet first. About the drafting studio. We have yet to talk about the pool, so let's do that. It's here for several reasons, some aesthetic, some practical. Aesthetically, obviously it's a triangle. He will tell you the desert is very sharp, very angular, so you see lots and lots of angles here. And he particularly liked triangles. In fact, he would tell you that if you stand here in the middle of the Valley of the Sun and you look around at all the mountains that surround us, what you see are 30 and 60 degree triangles. Interrupted, he said, with an occasional equilateral triangle. So triangles, very important to his thoughts about building organically in the desert. Now, from a practical standpoint, the pool is here for the canvas. When they went back to Wisconsin, the first few years that they were here, they took down all the canvas. They just rolled it up, stored it away in the kiva. They just deserted it, okay? And then they came back the following October, November, took the canvas out, they unrolled it, wet it, put it on these 4x8 wooden frames wet. As it dried, it would become taut, and then it would go back up on the superstructure as the ceiling and as the roof. Now, why canvas? That really 2 layers of canvas separated ultimately with by about 3 to 4 inches, like a 2x4, provides a very soft, pleasing, shadowless light. And it was enough light that you could actually do architectural drawings during the daytime. Sun is very intense here in the desert, even in the wintertime. So you could do architectural drawings inside without any additional type of illumination during the day. In fact, some of our early plans here were done right there on that little patio before the actual drafting studio was completed on brown butcher paper, because they were done outside. It was too intense to work on white paper outside. Okay. All right.
Here's another one, Chinese Ceramic Theater, bought in Chinatown, San Francisco, 1930s.
All right, folks, our next stop inside is going to be home, the garden room. But before we go in there, just one little bit of history here. First of all, this is called Sunset Terrace, and called that because basically it does face west. One thing I tried really never to do, well, unless he was constrained by a city lot, would be placing his buildings on a direct north-south, east-west axis. He said by doing that, you always had the potential to have a hot side and a cold side. But really more important to him, you would not get the interplay of light and shadow. And light and shadow was always very important to his thoughts about his organic architecture. What the sun did to his buildings as he went across the horizon morning until evening, both inside as well as outside his building. Now, light and shadow. Remember that short discussion we had about the relationship between architecture and music? It always described light and shadow as eye music. Eye music, okay? All right, we're going to go to his home. Next stop, and this is the entrance home. As you can tell by looking at that doorway, it's not going to be any grand entrance there. There's not going to be any two-story foyer for sure. In fact, the door described his door as a perfect use of leftover 2x12s. That's how he described his door, okay? Made for him by one of his apprentices at his instruction. So you're going to go into this space. Do pay attention in the foyer, folks. There's some interesting things going on there. Once you get inside, off to your right is the garden room. Now the garden room is about 50 feet by 30 feet, really the size of a modest-sized home, really. So walk around there, take your pictures, develop any questions you may have. Then there's some interesting looking chairs in there. They're called some wingback chairs, butterfly chairs. They're interesting to look at. They're equally interesting to sit in. So if you get a chance to sit in one of those, give it a try. Now, after you get in there and taking your pictures and develop your questions, I am going to ask you to have a seat. And the reason for that, if you recall, I said I was going to try to do my tour like giving you the tour. So if he had invited you into his home, but you were standing around in there too long, he would insist that you have a seat. He said people standing up in that space ruined his architecture, okay? Especially guys like my assistant over here.
Can't be too tall. So what's a natural 74 in here? Or no? Oh.
No, it's here. So there's some seats over here as well.
Oh, there's the piano.
We did like things that were Asian, so you see lots of Asian influence. The chairs are not only innovative in design, but they're also innovative in materials, in that they're made out of plywood. Now, plywood is not very innovative today, but laminated wood was something that was very, very innovative, okay? And they're also innovative from the standpoint that each chair is designed so it can be cut out of a single 4x8 sheet of plywood without too much waste. From Spring Green, which is about 40 miles from Madison, to Madison, Wisconsin, and he went to work for a construction company, and the owner of the construction company had an in with the dean at the University of Wisconsin School of Engineering, because they didn't have an architectural program. So he got enrolled as a special student, because he had not graduated from high school. But this special student status only lasted about 2 semesters. And the reason for that is not much of a formal student, so he just dropped out. His actual architectural education, if you will, was an apprenticeship under Louis Sullivan in Chicago. And that apprenticeship started in about 1888. He would have been, what, 21 years old. And it lasted up until 1893. And he was doing very well under that. That was kind of his niche. So he became Mr. Sullivan's drafting room assistant. He had an office right beside Mr. Sullivan's until 1893 when Mr. Sullivan fired him. And he fired him, I can tell you, for bootlegging houses. He was building houses on the side to support his wife and at that time 5 children. Mr. Sullivan didn't think that was appropriate, so he fired him. And then he installed a diesel stationary generator over behind where the gift shop bookstore is. And that provided electricity here until 1951. Those power lines came in 1946, but he hated them, called them eyesores. He refused to use power from them for 5 years. Okay, continued to use his diesel generator. Okay, they were very, very busy when they were here, so there were lots of projects that needed his guidance and/or approval. So if he's asleep on this side of his bed, napping, wake him up. Asleep on the other side of the bed, leave him alone. Now think about people coming to visit him from back east, Chicago, the Midwest. Most likely they would arrive by train, downtown Phoenix, and then they would have to get transportation 29 miles out in the desert on poor roads. Really, folks, most times non-existent roads, just some signs stuck in the sand. So they could arrive anytime, day or night. Remember, he died in 1959. The first phone came in 2 years later in 1961, so there was never a phone here when he was here.
There must be a little closing. No, I would
And there was one over here.
Yes.
That was, did you see the one up over there?
Cannon Ford. I couldn't help myself. It's just ventilation. There's a hallway back there and 2 restrooms that are back there, so it's just ventilation. Because if you know something about Asian mythology, you know that dragons are really more water features than they are fire features. Wright said she didn't care about that. She wanted her dragon to be spitting out fire. So she had some of the apprentices, poor guys, move the stone and the dragon various places, ended up here. It's plumbed up to propane, so when we have night lights tours or other functions at night, it spits out a flame about 1 foot or 1.5 feet.
The heart of every room, he said, is the fireplace.
Almost every single week, all the apprentices got dressed up. Gentlemen in tuxedos, ladies in cocktail dresses, and they came in for an evening of eats, drinks, and entertainment. Started in the garden room, drinks and hors d'oeuvres, migrated over here for some kind of entertainment. Loved his movies, so that's why we have a projection booth in the back of the room and a movie screen up here. Loved his movies, foreign and domestic. Anybody recognize the name Ann Baxter? She was a movie actress, Academy Award winner, 1947, Best Supporting Actress. Nominated as Best Actress in another famous movie. TCM shows it almost every single month, All About Eve. And she was nominated as Best Actress along with Bette Davis. Neither one of them won the Oscar for that, but a very well-respected actress. Ann Baxter was granddaughter by his wife, Catherine, by his daughter, Catherine. So he had lots of contacts in Hollywood. In fact, his eldest son, Lloyd, became an architect, a set designer for Paramount Pictures as well. So lots and lots of Hollywood celebrities of the day came to visit. Now, like I said, it was a community though, so it wasn't just an architectural apprenticeship program. There were people that came here. You guys have seen all the sculptures you've seen throughout, all done by one of Mr. Wright's former apprentices, Heloise Christa was her name. She came and spent her entire adult life here. March the 9th of last year, she celebrated her 92nd birthday right here. March the 11th, she passed on. Okay, folks, first of all the buildings we've seen on this part of the early tour up until this point were all done, at least initially, during 1938 through 1941-42. Wright came back every year with those fresh eyes, so they were always changing. But the last 2 buildings we're going to see were built in the 1950s. The Music Pavilion, by the way, was the last structure built here during. It was built in 1956 and opened in 1957. Now, it's the only major building that's ever burned down here. Burned down in 1963, was rebuilt 64, 65. Now, it was struck by lightning. Now, the lightning strike wouldn't have been so disastrous other than they were trying to solve leaky roof problems, and they were using some kind of waterproofing material that turned out to be very flammable. So lightning struck it, it went up like a match, okay? So it was rebuilt, and early, when it was originally built, it's called Pavilion because it was open on 3.5 sides. When it was rebuilt, it was closed in.
by.
As you can see from this poster picture, this is an orchestra here. In fact, the lady playing the harp is Ivana, his youngest daughter. So the orchestra is here. Then where I'm standing, this floor actually comes up, and this is an orchestra pit under here. Okay, so put on lots of performances. Anybody recognize these dancers? Does anybody recognize them? Don't say Martha Graham. It's not true.
Alvin Alley.
That good. Another good thing. I know my assistant over there, Al. He wants to say the Rockettes from New York City, but that's not right either. Al. By doing so, as you were building these buildings, you were learning architecture. But you were part of the community. We talked about that. And if the community needed a dance recital put on, then you made your costume, you practiced, and you put on a dance recital. So these are apprentices. Okay. Into the School of Architecture in the late 1980s, when several states started to say, if you want to be licensed in our state, you must have graduated from an accredited program. Apprenticeships no longer work. So the apprenticeship program turned into School of Architecture. We are a fully accredited Masters of Architecture program. We're not associated with any other college or university. We're a standalone school. This year, when they came back from Wisconsin, 19 students came back. In January, we added 6 new students, 5 of whom were females, I might add. So this year, our student population is about 60% female, 40% male. Last year was opposite. About 30% of our students are foreign students, international students. So now you come with a baccalaureate degree. Doesn't have to be in architecture, even though 99% of them are. Doesn't have to be. So you come here with your bachelor's degree, stay 2, 2.5, 3 years for your fully accredited Masters of Architecture degree. Okay. On our tour, Cabaret. It's the only subterranean building on the campus. He decided he was going to have a subterranean cabaret. Was very enamored of underground cafes that he had experienced in Paris and in Berlin when he was there in the early 1900s. So he wanted this one to be subterranean, so he brought in a bulldozer and they dug it down as far as deep as they wanted it, sent the bulldozer away. Decided it should be deeper, brought the bulldozer back, dug it a little bit deeper, sent the bulldozer away. Decided it should be deeper, but he did not want to pay to have the bulldozer come back, so he said, oh, just let the apprentices dig the rest of it by hand, okay? And they started digging it by hand in 1949 and opened Christmas week 1951. So they dug on it for a while, okay? As you go into this space, you're going to go into a foyer very similar to the one that we saw in the garden room, except this one's going to be different. It has a cast iron Buddha head in it. He took it back and forth to Wisconsin every single year himself. In fact, it was called the Traveling Buddha. So past the Buddha, down a long, narrow corridor, you're going to end up at a massive stone fireplace. In front of the fireplace, you're going to make 2 left-hand 90-degree processional turns, and then you're going to come down a ramp to be seated. He rode right beside him in his car.
Huh.
On the train.
Where did he get it? Do you know?
Oh, yeah. He got it in one of his trips to the Far East. I think it's Thai, I think, but I'm not sure. About 80% underground from where I'm standing, dug by apprentices, as I described. Now, you might expect a room like this to have some cave-like features, maybe an echo. There are no echoes in this room. In fact, it's said to be 95 to 98% acoustically pure. You ladies and gentlemen on the back row back there can hear me just as well as the folks up here in the front. I learned a lot about acoustics when he was working with Louis Sullivan. The firm was Adler and Sullivan. They did a lot of performance spaces. Mr. Dankmar Adler was an acoustical engineer, so about acoustics early in his career. Now, the acoustics in this room are great for many reasons. I'll just have time to give you a couple. Desert masonry, rubble stone construction, walls and ceiling. There are no smooth surfaces in this space. It is a hexagon, 6-sided, but as you can see, it's very, very asymmetrical, irregular. So there are no parallel walls in this room where the sound can bounce back and forth. And really, there are no 90-degree angles in this space where the sound can come in and be sent back out as an echo. Now, if you recall back in the office, I said he was born in 1867. And he was born in 1867, remember? Canadians, 1867. All right, and that's when he was born.
But from about 1924 on, he officially started to say he was born in 1869. Officially. In fact, it's so official on his tombstone. His birth date is June the 8th, 1869, on his tombstone. Now, November 1924 was when he met Oglivana, his third and final wife, at the Chicago Ballet. So the only thing we can kind of come up with, at least that's what I've done, is that by changing it from 1867 to 1869, that would mean that he was only 30 years older than her, not 32 years older than her. So officially, that's what it was. So they celebrated his birthday when he said he was born, 1969, right here. You know, it's not so important as to how we celebrate the 100th. It's really going to be much more important as to how we celebrate the 200th. Are his ideas still going to be as fresh and current then as they were when he was with us? Her response was, yes, I'm certain that they will. I guess mine, 152 years from when he was actually born, is the same, and I hope it's yours as well. Thank you very much for spending part of your...
I've said it a couple times.
Oh, hello,
Okay.
I'm here with our tour guide.
Okay.
Your name is Bruce.
Bruce, right.
We are now exiting.